Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
So Parliament will have its say on Britain's divorce from the EU after the Supreme Court told the government that it could not trigger Brexit without passing an Act of Parliament first. The Brexit Secretary told MPs that he respected the court's decision and would table a bill in the next few days. Most MPs and Lords are expected to vote it into law, but Labour and the SNP have said they will try to amend it. More from Scotland and the rest of the country in a moment, but first, here's our political editor, Gary Gibbon.
This is an odd one, Krishnan, because there was the government dreading this judgment, fighting it, spending public money trying to stop it. And yet, when you stand back and look at reactions through the day, it's the government that looks quite chipper. I think if this had all happened 82 days ago when the High Court originally gave its verdict against the government, things might have been a bit more nervous in the government. Things are a bit more fluid. They feel they've put their own shape on events. They feel they've borne down on critics within Parliament. But a parliamentary chapter now opens in this story. You can never be quite sure where those sort of chapters will end, and this is how the day went here. The Supreme Court ruled that the Prime Minister needs to pass a bill in Parliament before she can start the process of leaving the EU. It could be a very brief bill indeed, the court said, but it had to be passed. The government had been wrong to think it had the power to quit the EU without MPs' approval.
Today, by a majority of 8-3, the Supreme Court rules that the government cannot trigger Article 50 without an Act of Parliament authorising it to do so.
The judges unanimously rejected the idea that the devolved administrations in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland should vote on triggering Brexit.
They should never have been excoriated.
The small cluster of pro-EU campaigners celebrated anyway.
You've still got hope alive. You think this could be stopped?
Absolutely.
But in the 82 days since the appeal to the Supreme Court began, opposition to Brexit in Parliament has wilted under pressure.
You feel with the case that you two helped to bring that you've given Parliament an opportunity it otherwise didn't have.
I think so, yes. There's a
How
very
do you
good
feel
option.
if it doesn't use it? And it just lets Theresa May stick to her timetable?
If
very
Parliament
little change?
doesn't use it, that is as much a disgrace as far as democracy is concerned as it would be if the government had ramrod the royal prerogative through.
The ministerial car had gone astray, so David Davis, Secretary of State for exiting the EU, walked to the Commons. He told MPs a short bill would be produced soon.
I have to appear in front of Parliament, please.
The Prime Minister was not aiming to sideline democracy. She was aiming.
The Prime Minister spelt out referendum to the Labour benches.
She was aiming to carry out the will of the people. 17.4 million of them in the national interest.
The pressure of those referendum numbers means the big Commons vote triggering Brexit will not be a close-run thing. The SNP and a few Labour rebels will join with the Liberal Democrats and smaller parties opposing Brexit, probably not mustering triple figures between them. Voting for Brexit will be virtually all Tory MPs, perhaps 2/3 of Labour MPs. Quite a few will be abstaining, with others commanding a thumping majority. But the Labour leader hopes he can get majorities to amend the bill along the way, perhaps forcing the government to produce a white paper or policy document outlining Brexit plans, perhaps forcing them to give a vote to MPs probably next year on whether to send the PM back with a different negotiating strategy.
We need to be informed, be able to challenge, be able to overturn, if necessary, the objectives and direction in which the government is going on those negotiations.
Brexit means Brexit, cake means cake. Must eat the cake and have it.
Across all parties, some think a dramatic economic downturn next year could mean issues like whether to stay in the customs union look different to voters and MPs in a year's time.
Those people down there waving the flag of Europe, thinking it might not happen.
Well, they're fully entitled to. This is
But
a
they're
democracy.
deluded in your view.
No, they're not deluded. I mean, if public opinion were to change on this matter, Parliament might reconsider it. I don't think we should ignore that possibility.
In the Commons, David Davis tried to warn off Remainers who might try to use Parliament to stop or dilute Brexit.
Parliament will rightly scrutinise and debate this legislation, But I trust no one will seek to make it a vehicle for attempts to thwart the will of the people or frustrate or delay the process of exit from the European Union.
The Supreme Court has judged MPs must authorise the triggering of Brexit. Now, starting with debates in the Commons next week, we'll discover Parliament's appetite for challenging Theresa May's plans.
Gary, where do you see the trouble coming, if any, with this bill?
It comes soon next week. We probably move to the Commons starting on Monday, be a week or so in the Commons, a bit longer in the Lords. As I said, the big votes are not so much the problem here. It's the amendments along the way. And it sounded a little bit in the House of Commons, though. You could imagine a coalition forming of Conservative and Labour MPs trying to get a white paper out of the government. That would force Theresa May to do something she doesn't want to do, write down on a piece of paper, more or less the point she made in her speech, probably, but in a way that she can be held to account more and have this document waved at her over time. But I think the key amendment they'll be looking for is trying to put some sort of time device under her Brexit plans so that later, not so late that it's right at the very, very end of the entire process, but late enough that the negotiations have started. We know the outline of the plan. Parliament, some MPs in Parliament would like to have a vote whereby they could turn around and tell Theresa May, actually rip up that plan and go back with another one. Whether they get there, another matter.
Thanks, Gary.
Well, outside the corridors of Westminster, what do people make of the ruling? Our social affairs editor, Jackie Long, has been to Thurrock in Essex, which had one of the highest votes in favour of Brexit anywhere in the country, to speak to those who voted out.
Away from the grandeur of the Supreme Court, and it's on the streets and doorsteps of Britain that today's decision really matters. For all the talk of uncertainty, here in Essex, one thing was quite certain. They wanted out. Thurrock recorded one of the highest votes for leave at just over 72%. So what do they make of the fact Brexit negotiations can't go ahead without Parliament's say-so?
Me, personally, I want it to be out. It's as simple as that. You know, if it goes through Parliament and then it goes the other way, fair enough. Democratic process. That's what the country is.
But I mean, of course, people are saying they've had a democratic process in the referendum.
But Parliament weren't involved. So, you know, everybody should be involved.
Even though we voted out, still, people that wanted in can still have a say in that. Yeah, I agree with that then. The Parliament should have a say in that.
But for others, today's decision is about anything but democracy.
We voted out. We're English people. I'm not saying Britain because everyone can be British. I'm English and we voted out.
What is wrong with it going through Parliament?
I don't know. I don't really understand why they're putting their nose in. If we voted it out, surely she's got to say we're out.
Do you feel disappointed?
No, not really. What do you expect with it? Come on.
Yes, I suppose it is a worry for me that they're going to water it down. I think they're going to make some sort of attempt to, what can I say, sort of inveigle their way out of the heart of what we wanted when we wanted to vote out. We wanted to go out completely and not have some kind of midline that they can sort of wiggle it one way or the other.
And what do you feel about that?
It annoys me slightly, if I'm honest with you.
However quickly the government put together a bill, the very fact Brexit plans are having to go through Parliament is fueling fears among some that the referendum's promise of giving power to the people is not quite what it seemed.
Well, Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, is furious that the devolved assemblies won't be getting their own say, declaring it showed that claims about Scotland being an equal partner were simply empty rhetoric and worthless. And she warned it might be better to take our future into our own hands. Our political correspondent, Michael Crick, is in Edinburgh. Michael.
Well, last week, Alex Salmond said there could be a second independence referendum as early as the autumn of next year. That would be just 4 years after the last one. And Nicola Sturgeon has said that it would be logical to hold such a referendum before the end of the Brexit negotiation process, which ends, of course, in the spring of 2019. And certainly after today, the Scottish Government does seem to be running out of options, and a referendum looks ever so slightly more likely.
On the devolution issues, the court unanimously rules that UK ministers are not legally compelled to consult the devolved legislatures before triggering Article 50.
Today's judgment held an extra dimension here in Edinburgh, since the Scottish Government had claimed the Holyrood Parliament also had a legal right to a say before the Article 50 process starts. By 11 to none, the highest judges in the land agreed Scottish MSPs would have no formal role.
The court is now adjourned.
Afterwards, Nicola Sturgeon again threatened a second independence referendum.
What's going to happen over the process of Brexit is going to have profound implications for our economy and our society, for every aspect of our life, and for Scotland simply to be ignored, I think, is not good enough. But it raises a much more fundamental question, much bigger than whether we're in or out of the EU, and that is who decides the big issues about the future of Scotland. Is that a Westminster government with one MP in Scotland, or is that the people of Scotland? And that's a choice that I think increasingly emerges.
So why don't we just go on with the referendum?
Well, I've made my views clear, I've made the process clear, and I'll continue to stand up for Scotland's interests.
Last week she agreed it was very likely all but inevitable. But a new vote on Scotland's future won't be simple. Nicola Sturgeon is saying that the people of Scotland are being ignored over Brexit. Do you agree with her?
I do, yeah. I do.
She's saying that perhaps the only answer is another referendum on Scottish independence.
Bring it on. Yeah, bring it on. Yeah.
Would you see a referendum on independence as a way of staying in the European Union?
It's a way of controlling our own destiny.
So do you think there should be another referendum on independence as a way of staying in the European Union?
We can't go on having referendums, that's for sure.
Asking people about Brexit.
I don't have a clue.
You don't have a clue?
No.
Do you know what Brexit is?
No, I do pay attention to it, pal.
Since meeting Theresa May in July, Nicola Sturgeon has demanded special arrangements for Scotland, such as remaining inside the single market. But today, one former SNP leader accused Sturgeon of pointless posturing in demanding a separate settlement the UK government can't deliver, he said. And this former deputy leader, who also backed Brexit, is equally critical.
My advice to her has been, publicly, because I'm not in the inner circles, is stop this obsession with Brexit, realise we're in a new paradigm. The day we voted to come out of the EU, it was a new paradigm.
So an independence referendum, say next year, would be a mistake in your view?
Very bad mistake. We would lose it because uncertainty would dominate it.
Law professor Adam Tompkins is the Conservatives' constitution spokesman at Holyrood. Scotland is now heading for a second referendum, perhaps next year, as Alex Salmon has suggested?
Well, I certainly hope not. And I tell you what, most Scots also hope not. I mean, support for a second independence referendum is falling through the floor as we speak. The most recent polls suggest that fewer than 2 in 5 Scots want a second independence referendum. Even a number of those people who want independence don't want a second independence referendum right now.
And some SNP figures are cautious about a second referendum next year. It would need a bigger public reaction to Brexit, they think, before it was worth the risk. Well, any calculations by the SNP about holding a referendum will be extremely difficult. Public opinion on the issue hasn't really shifted over the last 2.5 years, whereas the economics of independence do look rather less favourable. Much in the coming months could depend on the relationship between Theresa May and Nicola Sturgeon. They're due to meet, along with the other leaders of the devolved governments, in Cardiff next week.
Michael Crick. Well, joining me now is Gina Miller, the lead claimant who brought the legal challenge, and also joining us, Conservative MP Kwasi Kwarteng, Labour MP and chair of the Vote Leave Watch campaign, Chuka Umunna. Also here, UKIP's Patrick O'Flynn and Stephen Gethins from the Scottish National Party. Gina Miller, you've won them, these people, the rights to vote. What do you want them to do now?
Do their job. Debate in Parliament about the best course to take as we leave the EU.
But they're talking about this being very quick and simple. Is that what you meant? A quick and simple vote, just Get on with it.
That's not up to me. I'm not the politician. My question was a legitimate one to the courts about where powers begin and end. Where do the government's powers begin and end? And if the courts didn't think it was a valid question, and if it was a simple question to answer, we wouldn't have gone all the way to the Supreme Court. There were obviously things that needed to debate. That's why it wasn't unanimous. It was 8-3 win. But now it is a win, which means that Parliament, the MPs, have to now debate how we leave.
Kwasi Kwarteng, why did you call this outrageous and offensive, arrogant, when this began?
I did say that. I thought that, and forgive me if I'm being cynical, but I thought the reason why the court case was brought was simply one in order to frustrate the process, and many people feel that. I know Gina.
Do you think you were wrong about that?
Well, the process has been seen. We've seen through it. We've come to the end. And the judges have made their decision, and I respect their decision.
But do you respect Gina Miller's motivations?
I can't say what her motivations were. It seemed at the time, and I looked at some of the remarks that she made. Obviously, I've met her subsequently and know she's very charming and well-intentioned. But at the time, it seemed like sour grapes from people who were very upset that they'd lost the referendum and wanted to frustrate the result at any cost.
Was it sour grapes?
Absolutely not. I'm not sure how I can, on my own, have stopped the whole direction of Brexit. My question was a much more fundamental one. It was one about the foundations of our constitution. It obviously had ramifications for Brexit, and because it's this fundamental question about where the Prime Minister's powers begins and ends.
Chuka Umunna, as an MP, you think Brexit's bad for Britain, don't you?
I didn't support it. I voted to remain, but I accept the result. But, look,
you still think it's a bad idea, don't you?
It should not have been necessary for Gina to bring this case. There was a certain hypocrisy in those who argued for us to leave the European Union. They did so on the basis that Parliament, the voice of the people through Parliament, should be sovereign. And then the Prime Minister coming along like some pseudo-dictator, saying that only she should have a say on the way that we leave the European Union. I accept there's a mandate for the government to take us out of the European Union, but I'm absolutely clear I'm not going to just sit by while they do so in a way that is going to trash the livelihoods of middle and lower income people in my constituency, and to do so in a way which disregards many of the promises that were made. For example, a lot of people now who voted leave, who are watching this programme, expect £350 million per week extra to go to the NHS. We have a right through Parliament to hold them to account for those promises that were made and ensure that the way in which we leave the European Union is in the British national interest and the interest of families in my constituency and every other.
You and I were in the Parliament before the last election, and also before the referendum, and there was a vote in Parliament. You remember. You probably took part in it too. We had a vote to hold a referendum. It was very clear. Nobody said at the time that there was any way in which Parliament would reverse that result. I mean,
I'm not arguing.
It would make a total mockery of it.
I'm not talking about reversing. Look, I'm not talking about reversing the result. What I'm talking about is Parliament actually getting a say on the way in which we leave the European Union, which is going to have a fundamental impact on our public services.
The Prime Minister of being a dictator.
That was the word. That was like a saying that she can just take us out of the European Union on royal prerogative. And all that Gina's court case was seeking to do was to give you, me, every other member of Parliament on behalf of the people.
How are you going to do this? How are you going to do this? Because you can't put £350 million a week into an amendment, because that's a money bill. You can't amend Article 50. So how are you going to do all of this?
Well, this is the big question, because we don't actually know what scope there is going to be in the bill, which we've been told is going to be published on Thursday, for us to make amendments. And don't forget as well, Christian, it's not just the Article 50 bill, it's the Great Repeal bill as well. There's a whole raft of legislation. I mean, this is a huge
let me bring in Stephen
project.
Gethin, because you also think Brexit is a terrible idea, but unlike Chuka Umunna, who's going to vote it through with Article 50 ultimately, you're not.
Yeah, but today was about, and actually, one thing I'll say, and I'm glad Gina's here, we owe a debt of gratitude.
We do.
Democracy doesn't begin and end in the Palace of Westminster, and politicians in London need to start figuring this out. This is an enormous job, and therefore, scrutinising it, the impact it will have on universities, on our health service, on EU nationals who've made this country their home and should be able to remain, on our health, on a whole range of areas, is immense. And that's why you have a parliament to scrutinise it.
But you're not going to thwart the will of the people.
Hold on. And I have no idea why the UK government didn't want to put it under scrutiny. If they had the courage of their convictions and they were confident in what they're doing, they wouldn't have had a problem with this.
Patrick O'Flynn, is this what the Brexit Secretary meant by thwarting the will of the people?
Well, look, I find the views of all four other contributors somewhat deficient. Gina, I think, is what a demographer might call representative from a very small section of Britain, which is very high.
48%.
No.
Which section of society
Excuse me,
is that?
can I just finish? Yeah, very high-earning London households used to getting their own way, I would sum it up as. Kwasi, his government messed up. It was David Cameron's seat of his pants stuff. He said, listen, the referendum advisory and Article 50 not triggered as David Cameron promised straight away, which would have avoided all this. Stephen, Scotland voted to handle these issues as a United Kingdom and should accept the result. And if I can just finish, Chucker, you're so opaque. I know what your mate Paul Farrelly, who represents Newcastle under Lyme next door to Stoke-on-Trent, thinks. He's going to try and block Brexit. Your formulation of no blank cheques, you know, a lot of people think this guy is sitting on the fence. Now, I'm going to be knocking on doors in Stoke-on-Trent on Thursday. What should I tell a voter who says, I can't tell if that Chucker Immuno wants to leave or to stay in the EU?
I can answer the question directly. Yeah. I've said I accepted the terms under which the referendum was fought, the rules, and therefore I find it very hard to set my face against triggering Article 50 for that reason. Right. But that does not mean, and that's the process of triggering Article 50 for views, this 2-year negotiation process, that is very different from the content of the deal, and that's where the blank cheque is concerned. Because surely, are you saying, let me ask Patrick, are you saying that UKIP wants to give the Prime Minister a blank cheque to do whatever she wants on the deal? Are you seriously saying that?
I'm saying that you are obviously one of the 95% of Labour MPs who campaigned against leaving the EU.
Yeah, but what do you think they should do is to stay in? Should they just vote it through to give Theresa May the power to
Parliament effectively handed the decision to the British people and calling for parliamentary sovereignty only against the views of the people after having turned a blind eye to selling it out to Brussels for 40 years.
Hold on. Let me bring in Stephen Gethin.
You conducted, and I think Patrick here is stating why UKIP have never even saved a parliamentary deposit in Scotland. You're understating why we campaigned on it. You've campaigned on a blank piece of paper. You didn't give us any details about what you planned. That blank piece of paper was an act of gross irresponsibility. We're having to fill in the blanks and to touch up the mess that you made along with your colleagues in the Tory party.
We had an exhaustive referendum campaign.
It wasn't clear.
We had an exhaustive referendum campaign. Every conceivable issue was raised.
Well, we were promised immigration powers.
Maybe not Scotland alone, but Scotland had voted to take these decisions as part of a United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
Why are we revisiting all of this anyway?
Because they are.
We have to move on.
We do.
No.
Just let her make the point.
You need to move on.
Yes.
There wasn't any legal certainty about how Article 50 needed to be triggered. There wasn't. That's why I went to the courts. It's now been decided. You need to go ahead and have that debate in Parliament.
I give you credit, as I said, that the government
No, you don't give me credit,
sloppy.
actually, because you put me in a box and you don't know who I am. So how dare you presume you know who I am, that I'm a London elite
Look, there are
who lives
certain
in
facts of all of us that get written and London Remain household. A lot of the country think London high-income households used to getting their own way. Well, out in the country, there are many households that have hardly got their own way on anything.
You know nothing about me, so don't make this personal.
I agree with Gina on this.
Don't make it personal. Talk about my case, not about me.
I agree.
I was just saying you represent a certain strand
No, I
of
don't
opinion.
actually represent anyone other than myself. I represent myself.
If you look at my constituency, 80% Remain.
Yes.
The idea that somehow everyone's having a ball and it's wonderful and there's a bunch of rich people living in £1 million houses is simply not the case. I tell you, 40% of children growing up in my constituency are living in absolute poverty. So don't go around making these sweeping generalisations.
Let's get to the debate that Gina Miller has forced, which is the kind of Brexit and the kind of Article 50 negotiation we are going to have. Kwasi Kwarteng, why do you want this to be a quick rubber stamp? Why shouldn't MPs get to decide on Theresa May's 12-point plan?
This is a complete fantasy. We are about to engage, once Article 50 is triggered, on a very complicated set of negotiations with 27 other member states of the EU. Nobody has any idea, nobody around this table, nobody in the country has any idea how those negotiations
But if a majority of MPs think leaving the single market is crazy, why should you get a rubber stamp?
That you can have an amendment that will bind the government's negotiating position for 2 years, regardless of what the other people are saying, is insane. There's no way you can do that.
Stephen Gethens, is there any way you can force the government to come back to Parliament?
Well, do you know something that strikes me is we offered a compromise around this. Before Christmas time, we offered a compromise. The UK government aren't willing to meet us halfway. Now, we will be using everything at our disposal. We'll be putting down amendments. The Scottish Government will be doing what we can do. Now, this should be part about having a sensible debate. This is an enormous issue. It has effect on quality of life. Chuka was quite right. He was talking about the poverty that exists in his constituency. Poverty that could be made worse if you don't get this right in terms of jobs in the economy. This is why we have a parliament. And again, coming back to Gina, that parliaments and democracies rely on citizens being engaged. They don't just rely on the MPs going away. And that's what we've seen in this. And actually, we should all be ashamed of the fact that it's taken a private citizen to bring this back and to underscore democracy.
Chuka, let me ask you, Nicola Sturgeon said, regardless of the ruling in the Supreme Court, there is a moral obligation to give Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland a say in this negotiation. Is she right in that?
Well, I think this is a UK-wide decision, and there are certain processes. The Council of Ministers across the UK from the different devolved administrations where they should be consulted. But this was a UK decision.
So no? Is that what you're saying?
Personally, one of the reasons I campaigned so strongly to remain is because I hate the politics of division, this idea of setting different groups against each other. And my fear with Nicola Sturgeon's approach is that in the end, her principal interest is dividing our country and splitting off Scotland. That's my view, and I don't agree with it.
Do you know something? In Scotland, we voted 2-1 to remain, and we were promised during the independence referendum.
It was 2-1.
It was
60-40
to remain. Okay.
It was 60.
And if we go back, to your argument from earlier on as well, you were talking about the independence referendum. We were promised the only way that you can remain part of the European Union is by remaining part of the United Kingdom. Then we were promised during the EU referendum campaign by Michael Gove that, well, you could get some powers over immigration. That's been refused. Then we were told that we'd be a partnership of equals and we could have an equal say in partnership with the United Kingdom. That's been refused. All these solemn pledges that have been refused time after time. Now, the Scottish Government has a responsibility to defend jobs, the economy and the interests of people in Scotland, the same way with the Welsh Government and the Northern Irish Government. Now, we've put forward this compromise. We're trying to reach a halfway. This was a pretty big deal for the Scottish Government to do, even trying to put to one side the independence referendum, and that was turned down. And I'm not sure what kind of message that's sending out, but it's not a good one about partnership.
Aren't you helping the cause of Scottish independence by not giving them a say?
Well, I think the UK decision was made as the United Kingdom. I think Chuka made a very good point about that. I think the vote in Scotland, and I see SNP MPs all the time, was slightly closer than you've put out. It's 60-40. And it's very striking. And it's very striking that every single one of the SNP MPs, 56, speak for Remain. But 40% of the actual entire population of Scotland voted for Brexit. And that's a very interesting democratic deficit that you have to square.
All of our constituencies voted Remain. You talk about representing your constituents, OK? My constituents voted overwhelmingly to remain part because our jobs at University of St Andrews, jobs are really tied up in the European Union.
Iron discipline on one side of the question.
Well, no,
we all know that Scotland was quite split on this issue. I mean, even you have to accept that. And I think that's an interesting debate. And I think if they want to go down the path of independence, that's up to them. But be careful what you wish for.
I'm going to give Gina Miller the last word. I mean, you've unleashed this debate. It's already begun. What do you think?
Well, I thought it was a very interesting point. You were talking about listening to the 40% in Scotland as well as the 60%. Right. What about listening to the 48% in the UK, the 52%? Because actually, if anyone tries to bring up a sensible debate about Brexit and our way forward, they're shot down in flames. And I've experienced that for 7 months from all walks and all media. So I think we have to have fairness as we go forward. It has to be a sensible debate. And that's what I'm asking you all to do.
Are you giving
that's
up
why
now?
I spend my money.
Are you out of this now, or are you going to keep
fighting? I'm not a
politician?
I'm going to go back to my day job, and it's over to the politicians now. I know my case has been brought into politics, but I'm not in politics.
Thank you all very much indeed for coming in tonight.